Ever get the feeling that some corners of the financial world, well, they like to dress things up a bit, make them seem shinier than they really are?
Oh, absolutely. Happens all the time.
Right. Like, take covered call writing on the S&P 500. It's got this reputation, right,
Yeah.
as a way to, like, reduce risk and keep pace with the market. But we've been diving deep into some research, and let me tell you, the findings are raising some eyebrows.
It's one of those strategies that, on the surface, can sound almost too good to be true. You own the S&P 500, or at least a basket of stocks tracking it, and you sell call options on that same index, hoping to generate income that cushions any potential blows if those stocks take a hit.
Yeah, and it's got some big names attached to it, too. We're talking the CDOE's Buy Right Index, the BXM, and there are those who'll tell you, straight up, it matches the S&P 500's returns, but with less volatility.
And that's precisely where things get interesting. There's this paper, The Superior Performance of Covered Calls on the S&P 500, Rethinking an Anomaly. Brooks, Chance, and Hemler, they really dig into this. And their argument is that this whole idea of covered calls being some superior strategy, well, it might hinge on overlooking a key statistical factor:
Let it rip. What's the missing link?
skewness. They say traditional performance measures often miss the impact of skewness in covered call returns.
Okay, time for a quick detour for our listeners who might not have skewness on speed dial. How would you break that down?
Think of your classic bell curve, a normal distribution. Skewness is when that curve gets, well, skewed. One tail stretches out longer than the other. What it means in finance is that returns aren't symmetrical. Covered call strategies tend to lean toward positive skewness,
Lizzie,
meaning you might see some big wins every now and then, but those are outnumbered by smaller, more frequent losses.
so it's like, those folks you see at the casino, playing the slots. They might hit a jackpot once in a blue moon, but mostly it's just a slow trickle of small wins and losses.
You've got it, but here's the thing. Those traditional performance measures, they don't always capture that whole picture. They might make things look rosier than they really are.
And that's what these researchers are saying is happening with covered calls.
Exactly. Brooks, Chance, and Hemler, they looked at the BXM and other covered call strategies. What they found was that even if you've got perfectly priced options, those traditional measures might still be painting a misleading picture of outperformance, all because of this skewness that's not being factored in properly.
Okay, so if we can't rely on those traditional metrics, what's the alternative? How do we get a realistic view of covered call performance?
That's where Brooks, Chance, and Hemler get really interesting. They propose two different ways to measure performance, and both are designed to account for this skewness issue.
Okay, I'm intrigued. What do they suggest?
One way they suggest is incorporating a benchmark, comparing the strategy's performance to something like, say, just holding the S&P 500. The other focuses on actually subtracting that benchmark.
So cutting through the noise and seeing what the covered call strategy itself is really bringing to the table.
Precisely.
All right, so they crunch the numbers, they adjust for skewness. What's the verdict? Do covered calls still come out on top?
Here's the kicker. Even with these new adjusted measures, they found very little to suggest that covered calls were generating significant alpha.
Alpha meaning outperforming the market, right?
Right. So basically, they weren't necessarily beating the market in a way that was anything special.
Wow. So what we're really talking about here is a reality check. Covered calls, they might seem like a sure thing at first glance, but if you don't look closely at the data,
You might be in for a surprise. It highlights something crucial in finance critical thinking. Don't just accept those big, bold claims at face value.
especially when options are involved, right?
Exactly.
This has been eye-opening, to say the least. But let's bring it back to our listeners. What's the key takeaway here? What do they really need to remember about skewness and covered call returns?
Don't let those impressive-looking numbers fool you. They might not tell the whole story. Look beyond the surface, understand how performance is being measured, and consider what might be hidden beneath the hood.
Love that analogy. Don't just trust the glossy brochure, pop the hood and see what's really going on.
Right. Because a strategy that shines brightly on paper might not be so luminous in real life. And never forget your own risk tolerance. What works for one investor might not work for another.
Couldn't agree more. So listeners, if covered calls are part of your playbook, or if you're considering adding them, keep today's conversation in mind. Skewness matters. It can make an average investment look stellar, or it can mask the risks lurking beneath the surface. Do your homework, ask the tough questions, and make informed decisions. And as always, thanks for diving deep with us.